treatment, and this is where it gets really, really interesting. And one thing that we have to learn about before we start talking treatment in autism, whether it's AAC or something else, is about the distinction between science versus pseudoscience. In autism treatment, the world is often full of miracles. And here's one of them.
Dolphins have intrigued humans for millennia. So unlike ourselves, and yet so accepting of our species. These remarkable creatures have unlocked the silent world of a young boy.
Ball.
8-year-old Thomas Carlin was born with a rare genetic disorder. For Thomas and his family, the communication has been a heartbreaking struggle.
I want a son who can turn around and call me Dad. I know he knows what I'm talking about. And I know he knows what this ball is. And what we're going to try and get him to do is to tell us exactly what it is he wants. Because it's all about giving Thomas a life of his own. We always felt that we needed to find a key for Thomas, something that was going to unlock his mind. And I'm sure that in the Dolphins we found that key.
For the past 4 years, the Carlings have traveled from the north of England to the Florida Keys for a special kind of therapy. Though it involves a trained therapist, the Dolphins themselves are pivotal.
They're actually opening his mind. There's a connection that's happening between them and him, and that's being sort of worked with by the therapist. And really what it's doing is it's getting his mind to actually think on something. And we actually think it's this stimulation that is helping him to learn and developing this brain that is basically going much slower than any normal child would.
Alphonse wants you to throw the ball. Alphonse wants you to throw it. Let's say. Ball.
Thomas has developed a passion for the Dolphins here at Dolphin Human Therapy. Speech therapist Janet Skinner uses Thomas's love for the animals to focus and motivate him. Without language, they have spurred him to reach beyond his limitations.
There you go. Good job, Thomas.
For the first time in his life, Thomas has begun to communicate. Something his family never dreamed possible.
So this therapy is called Dolphin Assisted Therapy. And I want to ask you, what do you think about the validity of this technique? How much do you believe in that it's the dolphin that cures the child of his or her condition? The idea has some type of acute factor, right? It's appealing, it's intriguing, because there seems to be some miracle type of connection happening between the animal and the child, so that suddenly there is some therapeutic effect being noticeable in the child. When we look closer, however, and this would be an example of pseudoscience, there is really no research behind it, no documentation what exactly is that mechanism between the client, the child, and that animal that then enhances speech and language development, communication development, and so forth. It is also very suspicious that the promoters of dolphin therapy are saying this helps whether you have autism, developmental disability, aphasia, variety of internal disorders, you have some addiction, drug problem, and so forth. Whenever a huge treatment claim is made that just one therapeutic or pharmaceutical technique would help an entire range of disorders, it's always very an issue of very unlikely that one and the same thing can help cure everything that's out there, right? When Lynn Hewitt, who is head of the Escher division on speech and language, on child language disorders, reviewed the evidence behind it, she was not able to locate any studies specific to autism spectrum and wasn't able to find studies that have a certain level of experimental control so that we would have confidence that it is truly the animal-assisted therapy that caused some type of positive effect on the client with a communication disorder. So something like that, a huge treatment claim and a miracle behind it, and we don't know exactly how it works, and there's no supportive evidence for this, no empirical studies that clearly document how would it lead to an intervention effect. That is an example of pseudoscience. And pseudoscience is defined as some type of pretended or spurious science. There's a collection of beliefs about the world, and this is mistakenly presented to you as if it were the truth. And it's presented to you as it were scientific, but as a matter of fact, it's not. Right? Such treatment claims, they appear to be but are not objective. They are not rooted in the larger methods of science. And this is oppositional to what we should be engaging in as a discipline of speech and language pathology. We should be doing evidence-based treatments, evidence-based clinical services, and this is sort of the opposite to that paradigm. And such treatment claims deserve careful scrutiny. Why does this happen so often, and particularly in autism? Autism seems to be a ripe ground for unsubstantiated claims. Well, in autism, you often don't notice physical differences in children, and it's tough from the outside to kind of say something is wrong with the child, or something got better with the child. We've heard this morning that autistic symptoms are primarily or exclusively interpreted based on behavioral observation, and such behavioral observations, they can be interpreted totally differently from clinician A to clinician B. And the developmental trajectories vary individual. We also have heard this morning that oftentimes there are gains in development, in acquisition, in skill development. Children outgrow one label and they get a milder diagnostic label. And that can easily be misinterpreted as this is due to some specific therapeutic effort or some miracle happened, whereas it's just the regular developmental maturity and trajectory that that child is following. So here are the differences of science and pseudoscience. The scientific procedures and methods are listed on the left-hand side, and the pseudoscientific criteria characteristics are always on the right-hand side. In science, we engage in systematic methods to test the hypothesis. We make systematic observations and we verify. Our goal is always to verify that something has happened and replicate that, ideally by an independent observer, an independent team of researchers and so forth. In pseudoscience, proponents would engage in more subjective procedures. They often want to appear scientific, meaning they use terms that sound scientific to describe what they are doing, but there is in fact no systematic investigation, no evidence that's generated, no empirical validation of the proposed intervention effect. In science, we are looking at a productive process, an evolving process. In science, we are not sad or unhappy if we have a negative result in a treatment study, because that helps us to refine our treatments, to make things better, to come up with newer procedures that truly make a difference for the client. We are equally happy to find out what works for the client and what does not work for the client, because that is in the end what pushes us forward as a field and helps us get to a better refined understanding, accumulated growth of knowledge over time. And the non-results and the positive results, they lead to throw out features of a treatment that are not useful, and we keep those features of treatments and treatment packages where we know this truly makes a difference for the client. We don't have such an approach on the pseudoscientific side of things. There's not a productive process. Knowledge always stays the same. You will hear sentences such as, we know that this works, this has worked for 10, 20 years, and it will continue to work in that fashion. There's not an assessment of why did it work or why did it not work. And instead, there is this obsession with, well, we've done it this way all the time, and we just know it works. A knowledge based on age-old traditions, if you want to say it that way. In science, we have hypotheses. We're always keeping both ways of knowing open. Maybe I'm right and my treatment produces an effect, but I also keep the null hypothesis open that maybe I'm wrong and my treatment under investigation does not show the anticipated effect. So I'm open-minded in both directions. In science, I'm after verification, and I'm using strong empirical evidence, empirical investigations. I'm collecting data. I have a control mechanism. I have a control participant or a control group that does not get the treatment or that does get an alternative treatment. And that comparison, that will tell me whether or not my treatment was truly effective or not. Such experimental investigations do not take place on the pseudoscientific side of things. Often, what is being proposed is not verifiable, and other person cannot just recreate it, and it's based on beliefs. And then you have to rely on anecdotes, what some individual, probably with some statue, with some title or reputation, told you, and then you just, it's a matter of belief whether or not you take that for granted. So why can pseudoscience be so harmful? Why do we have to talk about this in autism treatment? There are three major ways in which pseudoscientific treatments are actually problematic. The treatment per se can be harmful. There's an example here of a 10-year-old Colorado girl that was smothered to death by engaging in a very controversial intervention called rebirthing therapy. Let's not do this, but let's say we are engaging in something that doesn't produce an intervention effect, then indirectly that can cause harm because it deprives both the individual and the family, the caretaker, of scarce time. It takes up financial resources or both. And then using unsubstantiated treatments, engaging in pseudoscience, gives our profession a bad name, and it's really against the paradigm that we should be subscribing to in the health sciences, healthcare professions, which is evidence-based practice. Right. So for clinicians, it's very important to learn to distinguish between scientific approaches and pseudoscientific ones. And fortunately, there is a list of warning signs that we can go through, that we can ask about a treatment to kind of get a better feel. Is this something I have to be careful about, or is it relatively well substantiated and it's safe to practice this and to put it into place? Okay. So the first question we always want to ask is the treatment unable to be tested or disproved? Pseudoscientific approaches may be vague or circumspect, making it difficult to think of a method to test them. You might hear claims such as, well, it only works in a context where the child is under no stress and the child is not being tested, and we can't really go in with any language or autism assessments, so it's not testable. This kind of raises suspicion. If no tests can be made, then the credibility relies on the developer's assertions. You have no method of verifying it. Proponents may ignore findings that raise doubt about the treatment, or they don't want to hear ad hoc hypotheses to deflect concerns. They might come up with one size does not fit all claim to defeat alternative results, other results that do not fit with the notion of the pseudoscientific claim. Another question to ask is, does the treatment remain unchanged even in the face of contradiction? In science, the goal is always to determine what is true. Disconfirming evidence should be used to correct mistakes, to reduce errors, and eliminate ineffective treatments. Like I said before, we're happy about the negative results or the not so promising results. They often tell us as much as the positive results do. Pseudoscientific approaches tend to avoid testing. Errors aren't corrected, everything stays at the same type of level. New findings are rarely incorporated. They do not want to know what else is happening, what can we learn from other professions, from related treatments. So the approach itself then remains founded on conviction and trust in theories, and facts are ignored. Is the rationale for the treatment based only on confirming evidence? It is rarely the case that for any treatment you only have positive results. Whatever you look at, all the established treatments, there's always some type of research report. It worked for the majority of kids, but for some kids it didn't work. And this is also important to know. You want to know for whom doesn't it work. That also influences your treatment decision and sound clinical practice. Supporting evidence increases the credibility of a claim, especially when it can be replicated by different researchers. We don't call something evidence-based practice or empirically supported treatment until another research team at another location independently has replicated those intervention effects. Truth is only demonstrated by eliminating the possibility that the claim is false. So we got to go engage in experimental research to make that happen. Pseudoscience, however, is usually based on confirming evidence alone. They don't want to deal with the negative data or results, and then those are being ignored, discredited, or not even being published, not even being made publicly available to you. Another warning sign: does supporting evidence rely on personal experience or anecdotes? There's nothing wrong when clinicians want to publish a case report and throw out an anecdote to kind of raise an issue and suggest this needs further investigation and we really need more research in this area. So to derive future hypotheses and research questions, a case report or a clinical anecdote is perfectly fine. But if I'm using that for a larger treatment claim and I'm saying, well, I've had this fantastic case and we went from 0 to 100 in just a week with fantastic method X, that is the wrong approach, because I don't have the data, I don't have the experimental research behind it to truly make such a strong statement. All right? And with case studies and anecdotes, we need to be careful. They tend to be highly selective. The patient wasn't randomly sampled, it was a hand-picked client. They can be susceptible to bias because maybe I, as a clinician, I wanted to see intervention success no matter what. Maybe I'm overly interpreting what I'm seeing a little bit. And if there's no control, then I don't have an experimental means of demonstrating cause and effect. A scientific approach, on the other hand, would require that change, behavior change, is documented with objective measures like standardized tests, with experimental controls and replication of findings. Pseudoscience avoids this more experimental approach and relies primarily on case studies, testimonials, anecdotes, and personal experience. So are there very strong claims that are incommensurate with the level of evidence needed? In the clinical field, in clinical research, as larger of a treatment claim I make, if I'm saying treatment X works for kids with severe autism, then I have to have a lot of evidence to make such a huge treatment claim. I have to have a series, not just one study, but a series of studies that have been replicated many times, not just by me, but with other researchers as well. And oftentimes, before we are saying something is effective, before we're calling it an evidence-based practice or an empirically supported treatment, there has been a phased model going from single case studies to larger control group, treatment group experiments to randomized controlled trials replicated across many sites before those standards for an effective treatment, for evidence-based practice and so forth are met. So the credibility should be based on the findings from each level of evidence, and I usually want to see this hierarchy of studies building up from small scale to large scale before I'm subscribing to saying this is truly evidence-based, it really creates an intervention effect. Pseudoscientists, on the other hand, may not provide sufficient evidence for their claims and insist that it's the role of the critics to prove them wrong. But that doesn't make any sense. It's not logical. If you make a treatment claim, you are the one that has to come up with the evidence behind that. Sometimes individuals want to force others to believe in them based on the status that they have, based on their personal authority. Maybe they have been the clinic director for 20, 30 years and feel they are the authority on this field, in this issue, and you should just believe what they are saying. This is also not scientific, of course. Is the treatment then unsupported by evidence that has undergone scrutiny? the traditional way to disseminate information in clinical research, in the research field in general, is to submit those findings to peer-reviewed journals. And in those peer-reviewed journals, people with expertise who are on the editorial board will review that manuscript and they will check it for errors, they will look through the experimental procedures, they will take a look at how treatment was set up and implemented and how the control groups were administered, to make sure everything is truly valid and the findings are, have credibility and have value. And this process helps to ensure the integrity of the scientific literature. And it's a tough process to go through. As if you are an author for a scientific journal, you have to go through really vigorous reviews and resubmissions before your article gets out there. Pseudoscientists try to eliminate such a rigorous way of dissemination. They disseminate information in other ways, often by direct presentations to the public. You go to more practitioner-oriented conferences and you speak directly with parents, caretakers, and practitioners to kind of surround this type of more rigorous mechanism. All right, another warning sign that might come up is a treatment approach disconnected from established scientific models. All scientific claims are usually consistent with the current treatment paradigm for a given disorder. Differences typically involve improvements or changes to current models, not entirely new approaches. If we are taking such an example, such as Dolphin therapy, we don't necessarily know how would that work. What is a good theoretical model to explain that bond that apparently appears between the dolphin and the young boy? How does such a bond translate into an intervention effect? In other words, what is the active ingredient in setting up such a scenario that leads to behavior change that makes the communication disorder improve? It's contradictory to current paradigms that we know about. What our understanding is how disorders work and how normal child language development would proceed. Pseudoscientific claims are often not consistent with such established theoretical knowledge and paradigms, and they have very little evidence to support them. At the same time, such new paradigms may appear very exciting, revolutionary, and are more compelling. Oftentimes there is a call towards the emotions of caretakers because they are desperate to find a cure or to find something that would work for the client, especially if it's severe autism. Many families are desperate for some type of cure or help, and pseudoscientific proponents may capitalize on that, unfortunately. Is the treatment described by terms that only appear scientific? Scientific terms are often, traditionally, are precisely defined, operationalized, and linked to observable, measurable events. And that has the advantage that these terms can be tested by anyone. I can give my protocol with my operationalized terms to Dr. Kwa, and she can do the same thing here at San Jose State, replicate my studies that I did at Purdue. In pseudoscience, however, there are terms and definitions being used that are not easily observable or measurable. So again, it becomes untestable. And those terms appear obtuse to avoid careful scrutiny and to hide their lack of meaning. They might sound very fancy, but there's nothing behind it. It just has some scientific appearance, but it has nothing to do with the scientific method. Scientists always carefully specify the conditions under which a treatment can be studied. In pseudoscience, we have less of a recognition of what those limitations in those predictions would be. In a group design study, you often get a percentage value of the likelihood that the treatment is not effective, or that your initial hypothesis would be rejected, is maybe 2%, maybe 5%, and so forth. So you're getting some type of an overview. How secure, how valid, how much credibility do those findings have? How likely is it that this truly generalizes to the larger population of test subjects? You don't get any of this in a more pseudoscientific way. Pseudoscientists are less likely to recognize those limitations, like I said, and claims are often designed more to appeal to emotions and to raise false hopes. They don't give us the data, they don't give us concrete evidence, concrete findings that we could replicate, that could make sense and outline both the effects as well as the limitations. Is the treatment claimed to be understood only in a holistic way? That would be another. My computer is still on.
Occasionally it shut down after a certain period of time. The whole thing. So it's not.
Okay. From the pseudoscientific proponents, this can only be understood in a certain context. You cannot put the person in a lab and then see and replicate that effect. You have to take the larger picture into account. So such claims that something can only be understood in such a larger context that may appeal to the general public, but it results in a vague approach to the problem, and then you don't know exactly what causes the treatment effect. How does the environment play into that? So that should not be not be done. Those were the 10 warning signs. Let's do a little bit of an exercise, and this is probably the biggest example for pseudoscience in augmentative alternative communication, a technique that originated in the early 90s by the name of facilitated communication, and in the 90s there was a huge debate about it, and we thought it was gone. There had been many studies, experimental studies out there that showed that this is an invalid treatment and this does not work, but it keeps on coming back, and it keeps on coming back in these pseudoscientific ways that just appeal to the general public but are not going through the scientific channels of scrutiny and dissemination. So here's a few examples.
He uses what's called facilitated communication, and I have an interpreter here that's going to be working with him to answer questions on the typer.
Okay, can you tell me about that?
She's basically providing resistive support to his hand, so when you ask him the question, then he will type what the answer is, and the device has a voice feedback, so you'll hear what his answer is.
Okay. If I don't understand him,
Right.
just wait until the machine produces the sound or produces the answer.
And he has sometimes about a 20-second delay, whether it's verbal answering or typing. So,
Okay. That's what I need to know.
Tonight on Frontline, the explosive story of a revolutionary method of communication.
Here was a means of expression for people who lacked expression. Here was a way that you could find out what people were feeling and what they were thinking.
Frontline investigates facilitated communication, the theory, the practice, and the controversy.
My God, it's really true. This stuff is bogus. It was just so clear. It's so unmistakable. I was sitting there watching this.
6 times 2.
Tonight on Frontline, Prisoners of Silence.
What if you had a lot to say, and after 14 years, could finally say it?
I need to eat.
Or better yet, hearing a sentence in your own voice for the first time ever.
I have you.
Good. Let's listen.
People at first can't believe it.
The Hope Technology Project is using Hewlett-Packard's new TouchSmart computer to change the lives of autistic children.
Now imagine not being able to talk, but having the ability to think rationally. It's almost as if you're imprisoned.
Not anymore. By sampling Jordan's words and sounds, the computer can reproduce his voice, stringing his thoughts into coherent sentences.
He can actually hear himself, which is very motivating for a child to be able to communicate with their own voice.
For 14 years, Jordan was nonverbal. After 6 weeks working on the Touch Smart, he's becoming the talk of the school.
A tortured and anguish-filled existence now becomes a life.
And the school goes a step further. Gone are the days when kids diagnosed with autism were segregated from other students. Here they work and learn with everybody else. Jonathan wouldn't want it any other way. It's called the Augmentative Assistive Communications Device. The kids just call it Light Rider. It lets them type sentences and immediately play them back.
This is a technology that can, I believe, be a catalyst to a communication explosion.
With the Light Rider and the Touch Smart computer, the future for these kids is right at their fingertips.
All right. What is problematic about it? Let's just start talking about this initial portrayal of facilitated communication. Why do we think this is an invalid technique?
Everything this doctor talks about is totally subjective. He's not citing any kind of empirical evidence. It's just all very vague and fuzzy.
Absolutely. And you can see this phenomenon, huge treatment claims, miraculous words and phenomena are created, and he doesn't really have any data to support this. The technique itself, what's wrong with that? Who is the originator of the message? Right. The initial method, as you could have seen in the video, was about hand over hand and then typing on a communication board or an alphabet board or on a device. And then how was this modified in the more newer videos? It's no longer hand over hand. There is like a stick that guides the hand of the individual. And I'm not saying that all of them are totally incompetent. It might be that the fellow that developed some speech and language on the touch screen, that he has some symbolic understanding and communication. But why would he need the stick? That doesn't make much sense, right? Why would he need the stick to be guided? And touch screen is pretty large. Why, if the argument is maybe they can't type those little letters on the Light Rider, you can have another device with bigger symbols on them. Why would you need that stick? That's really awkward, right?
Just thinking, like, where did they get these miraculous literacy skills to learn how to spell?
And then, exactly. This is exactly what the pseudoscience comes in. There is no theoretical model. We don't know we don't have any current scientific way of explaining how someone from being pre-linguistic, nonverbal, from one day to another develops those fantastic literacy skills. It just doesn't fit with our current understanding of child language development and disorders. All right. So if we are applying those 10 criteria, it's untestable, it remains unchanged even when negative study results are showing it doesn't work. It's only based on confirming evidence. Most of that evidence is anecdotal in nature. The evidence that exists for facilitated communication, those anecdotes, case reports, they are inadequate. They are not experimental studies. They haven't necessarily been avoiding peer review. There are actually professional journals that have published articles on facilitated communication. However, as you have pointed out, this is very much disconnected from current scientific understandings and paradigms. Not necessarily new terms are being used, but grandiose outcomes are being promised, and it's being displayed in this fantastic, miraculous way. And it's being said this can only be understood in a holistic context, and you cannot test these individuals in the lab environment. So in an earlier article in 2005, 3 or more different judges, I believe, looked at facilitated communication, applied those 10 criteria independently, and arrived at this overall ranking that 8 out of the 10 are fulfilled for facilitated communication. We thought facilitated communication was gone, but here are only a few of the current movements again in that direction. There is a foundation at the East Coast that gave away 29 million for further development of this method. The fellow who brought facilitated communication to the United States, Douglas Bigland, you could see him in the beginning. He was the man with the beard at Syracuse. He received another $1 million for his research. Even a federal agency, the U.S. Department of Justice, approves of this technique for interviewing victims with communication disabilities and cognitive disorders. Recently, a Michigan man spent 80 days in jail. His whole family was falsely accused of rape because of the use of FC, but it wasn't the client, it was the facilitator who had made that accusation. And then there have been many more imprisonments due to false facilitated allegations of rapes, and there have been objective demonstrations of successful FC. This is from Jim Todd. He is at Western Michigan University and has made this his major focus to look into pseudoscientific treatments in autism. So you can see how such approaches not only have the potential to cause harm to the client, but they can cause harm to the entire family and the social network around it. There's currently a bill being proposed in Massachusetts mandating FC training. In Colorado, they sponsor that type of training through their Developmental Disabilities Council. A fairly renowned journal published a pro-FC article in 2009 without questioning it. In Indiana, there is an interesting movement where they no longer call this technique facilitated communication because they know people would identify it as pseudoscience. So they're just giving it another name, and they're calling it saved by typing. Again, appealing to the emotions of families. I'm saving your child through this guided typing, which just seems like awfully wrong. And these are just only a few of the current ongoing activities. So the point is, unfortunately, it keeps coming back, and more families are getting an autism diagnosis. They haven't heard about the debates in the late 90s and early and late 90s, and then they get trapped into such pseudoscientific approaches. Another example. Let's watch this one and then see how the 10 criteria of pseudoscience apply to that one.
It came from a boy their foundation brought over from India. A boy who seemed very much like their own son, but with some dramatic differences. This child is challenging every assumption about autism, turning the world of Portia and John and thousands of other parents like them upside down. His name is Tito Mukhopadhyay, seen here when he was 10. Like Dove, he's severely autistic. He too is almost mute and has little control over his body. Now 14, Tito still exhibits all the same symptoms of autism, but he's doing what doctors, researchers, and most parents of autistic children once thought impossible. He has learned to write eloquently and independently about what it's like to be trapped in an autistic body.
I was able to ask Tito things I always wanted to ask my own son, Dove. Why do you flap? Why do you rock? Why can't you look in my eyes? And Tito could answer all these questions.
Through his writing, he told her he flaps his arms because otherwise he can't feel his body. He avoids eye contact because it's difficult for him to see and hear at the same time. What do you think the biggest misperception is that people have of people with autism? What we are seeing in Tito is unprecedented. By definition, people with severe autism have trouble with language, a notion that Tito shatters every time he puts pen to paper. That they don't have any understanding? Any understanding of what? Of anything. When you first met Tito, were you skeptical?
The nature of a scientist is to be skeptical. So I was certainly surprised when I met him to see the very compelling evidence that he was for real.
Dr. Michael Merznick has been studying Tito for more than a year. A neuroscientist at the University of California, San Francisco, he says Tito is not only authentic, but miraculous.
There can be little question in the writing behavior of Tito that he's providing the answers and that the answers are coming from his brain.
If Tito seems a miracle of autism, this is the miracle worker. His mother, Soma, who gave up a career in chemistry to devote her life to teaching her son, even though doctors in India said he would never be able to learn.
At first they told us he was mentally retarded because he looked that, because he wasn't doing anything. He wasn't doing what his age level, a 3-year-old child should do. So he did not respond, he did not do anything.
Were you told how to teach him?
No.
What were you told?
To keep him busy.
And she's been keeping him busy ever since.
5% square over here. Here. If you don't look, where is it?
As a young child, she noticed he was staring at calendars, so she started teaching him numbers and letters.
What are the factors of 6? Say the probably dice.
When he wouldn't hold a pencil, she used a rubber band to tie one to his finger and taught him to draw lines and eventually to write.
No, why is it coming down the line?
If her method looks simple, just ask parents of other severely autistic children. They'll tell you that at one time or another, they too tried to get their child to type or communicate with no success. But Soma's method requires tenacity.
Read the F properly. Write it again. Write it again. No one will be able to read that.
For the past 11 years, this tireless taskmaster has spent every waking moment talking and teaching.
Hey, now look at this. Oh, look at that.
Constantly prodding.
You're not even looking.
To keep Tito stimulated.
How will that look?
And his mind on track.
Look at that. No, not like that.
What would happen, do you think?
No, I did not, so I don't know. I can't even imagine myself doing that, yeah.
Her determination and her assumptions about Tito may have made all the difference.
Where?
She never doubted that he could learn,
No.
so she fed him a healthy diet of knowledge, from Shakespeare to geometry to music. Tito, without your mother pushing you, how would your life have been different?
I would having been out. I would have been a vegetable.
I would have been a vegetable? So it's a good thing that she pushed.
Yes.
Yes. He said he'd be a vegetable.
I think that's probably pretty accurate.
Though Tito seems to have escaped that fate through his writing, he remains severely autistic. He can't even pick up the pad and pencil to write without his mother's constant prodding and urging.
Right.
But when Tito does write, it is with astonishing insight, especially for a boy just 14 years old. He's written hundreds of poems, including this one, which we watched him write from beginning to end.
I have fancied a little dream, and the world is left unseen. With the light of your eyes, through the darkness of the night, I have held that little dream, beyond my world, beyond all seas.
Tito is a beautiful example of the possible. Here we have a boy that, largely through the empirical interaction of this boy with his mother, a way has been found into his ability, into his spirit.
Do you think that Tito is just one in a million?
I think there could be thousands, or maybe tens of thousands of Titos out there.
Scientists will soon find out if that's true. For the past year, Soma's been testing her homegrown methods on a small group of children at the Carousel School in Los Angeles, the school attended by John and Portia's son, Dove.
Yeah, Dove.
Like Tito, these 9 and 10-year-olds are severely autistic. Few can speak, and until recently, teachers had no idea if anything was actually getting through.
Who were the Native Americans there at the time?
Now they know.
Yeah.
In the space of a year, kids who were being taught on a kindergarten level are now being taught math, social studies, and science like 4th graders.
I had honestly never seen anything like this in my life.
Karen Spratt was their teacher. She had been trained in applied behavioral analysis, a treatment which has been very effective in teaching children with autism. Spratt says she was skeptical since Soma's techniques seemed to defy most of the principles of ABA.
Soma did everything that I was told not to do, kind of, as a teacher. So, for instance, she talked constantly.
The sun rises in the east or north. Pick up.
And that's the exact opposite of everything.
In my training, it was that you give basic directions and wait for a response, and not to verbalize too much because it could be distracting.
If 26 plus 2 is 38.
Instead of being distracting, Soma's rapid prompting method, as she calls it, seems to keep the children's attention focused long enough for them to communicate. She ignores their erratic movements and wandering eyes and focuses instead on the mind locked inside.
Line or the lines of longitude? No, it is the line of longitude. Now,
did you ever second guess your approach? Everything? Maybe this isn't right?
No. I'm always sure of myself, what I'm doing.
Why?
Because it works. It works.
And she offers some astonishing proof.
Tell me, what do you like best?
Dov Shestak was one of her first students, since it was his parents, Portia and John, whose foundation brought Soma to the United States. But they never expected this.
Math, yes? You like math? We can do some math over here to show up.
After years of trying nearly every technique available for autistic children, his parents were astonished. Within 6 weeks of working with Soma, suddenly came full sentences, complex thoughts, and words spelled correctly.
It is a flower, and that's a bulb. The best way I can put this is, it seemed like I was seeing the kid that had disappeared 7 years before, and suddenly, it wasn't just a one word or gesture I was able to get, it was whole sentences and ideas.
Keep going, I know what you mean, but finish it up.
I was like a kid in a candy shop, I didn't know where to start. What's your favorite color? What do you want to be when you grow up? I mean, all the questions you asked a child over years. Every day there was whole new sets of things I was finding out.
Hey, Dov, tell me, why do you like math so much?
They learned that Dov is interested in religion and history and is a surprisingly good mathematician.
Why? It's easy.
We asked Dov how he had learned so much when no one had formally taught him.
Come on, go ahead, come on.
He told us that all those years when people thought he was lost in his own world, he was actually listening to everything around him.
You learn to spell and you learn to do math.
Although Soma's method has not been studied scientifically, Mike Merznick is one of many researchers who think it should be taken seriously.
I think it's almost certain that this method can be used with many, many autistic children. And the initial indication from these studies in Los Angeles is that it might apply even to the substantial majority of these children.
That they might be helped by this method, by someone prodding them and telling them, think, do, act.
Exactly.
Scientists can't help but wonder what other secrets Tito, Dov, and others like them still hold.
Are you happier now?
But one thing is certain. The ability to communicate has had a profound effect on Dov's life.
Yes.
He's happier now, and you don't have to be a scientist to understand why.
Yes.
I can tell others my feelings. That's why you're happy.
After our report aired in January, Cure Autism Now received thousands of letters from families asking Soma to work with their children. Since then, she's worked individually with some 70 kids with autism, and the results, parents tell us, have been remarkable. Soma and Portia are now finishing a manual that will teach others how to use the rapid prompting method.
All right. So how do we feel about this one? If we're comparing the, yeah?
I just want to clarify. Is she always telling them what to spell? Is that, because I'm, through the different examples, I mean, that's how she was prompted. Like, she was basically giving them the letter to spell, right?
Most of the time I have never seen it in real, only through the video, through the TV examples. She prompts them all the time.
Right.
But in the end, we had seen a couple of clients that were fairly unprompted, I would say. It took a long time. I would question why that is necessary. We could probably communicate more efficiently through an EAC device. If it takes you five minutes to spell a word. But anyway, back to my original question. How does this compare to facilitated communication?
It's more appealing because there's not a direct hand.
Yeah. So the originator of the message might actually be that client, right? So maybe there is actually some value behind engaging in a lot of prompting and constantly telling them what to do. But what is the major mistake that's being made here?
No research.
No engagement in any data collection, no research. But what happens, nevertheless?
But people are using
An entire classroom already adopted this. Not even asking for whom may it work and for whom may it not work. What are the chances if you give kids two choices? And is the sun goes up in the east or the sun goes up in the west? Always a 50% chance they get the correct response, right? If you're not using any graphic symbols on those cards, how can it be that from one day, from kindergarten level, they go, in the weeks, they go to 4th grade? How did they learn literacy so quickly on giving on the... Again, there's a lot of questions that raise suspicion here that aren't answered. Also, maybe, we don't know, maybe the actual act of prompting holds a lot of value. But without doing the necessary research behind it and without collecting data behind it, we would never know. So it stays at the pseudoscientific level here. Its true value is never being explored. And then the approach that's being taken, I'm always sure of myself, which is not the right thing to do.
So I think that paradigm shift is worth investigating.
Absolutely.
I don't think we should completely, I mean, I agree that there needs to be some follow-up study, but I don't think we should just completely write it off as pseudoscience. I think it's worth investigating.
Yeah, that's the point. I mean, it could have some value, but right now we don't know. If they are rejecting towards scientific scrutiny and investigation, but pushing towards widespread adoption, it's a little bit unfortunate movement. We'll look at the pseudoscientific criteria in a bit. So this is also known as informative pointing. It is being displayed as revolutionary new intervention. It looks a little bit more valid than facilitated communication because you don't have this much of hand-over-hand guidance, and apparently they can get to a level of independently constructing sentences without physical prompt, but still with a lot of verbal prompts. However, authorship validation, ongoing data collection, other controls are vigorously avoided and discouraged. But because the students' response is typically made without physical contact with the facilitator, they appear to be, like I said, more genuinely independent than the manually guided responses of facilitated communication. There's methodological shortcomings, what the proper teaching method should be. If I only give two different choices, of course I'm going to always have 50% success rate at least. There's not a strong theoretical foundation of what the actual mechanism is that increases communication skills, and a complete lack of empirical support at this time. So if we are applying the 10 criteria, I'll do it rather quickly. We would find that now 7 out of 10 are being met. And to go back to your question there in the back, the lesson that we're learning here is distinguishing science from pseudoscience isn't always like a black and white approach. It's not always a clear-cut decision. Oftentimes the difference is rather in degree than it is in kind. This technique that we have seen here, the very last one, maybe it has some potential. Maybe there is some scientific value in it, but if we don't do the research behind it, if it stays at this current vigorous state, pushing widespread adoption, vigorous treatment claims, we would never know. So at this point of time, we have to label it as pseudoscience, and unfortunately the developers don't have that right handle on it to put it more into the scientific domain. All right. Your handouts give you an overview on what are the treatments in the various categories, where we have lots of anecdotes and speculations, little or no scientific data. You can see many of the vitamin therapies are in that domain. Then there are some that are already found through research, found ineffective or found harmful. Facilitated communication is in this one. Then those that have an emerging empirical base but still need more data behind them, limited scientific testing. Some of the AAC approaches, PACs in here. And those that have some substantial evidence, scientific evidence behind it, you can see how very few those are, and those are mostly those that come out of applied behavior analysis. All right. Because this has been such a problem in the field of autism treatment, we are currently seeing a huge push towards evidence-based practice, and that means information about the nature and treatment of disorders should be developed through research and other empirically based activities, not through false ways of knowing, not through faith, authority, or introspection. The conclusions about communication processes should always be derived from and supported by scientific evidence, and assessment and treatment methods should be evaluated by empirical methods. Basically, this is the gist then of research or evidence-based practice. Your handout lists you some institutions, some resources where to go for if you're interested in finding out what treatments work and which ones don't. There's a variety of good places where you would find such information. One place to start with would be what we call evidence-based practice journals. I've listed the most important ones on your handout. Evidence-based communication assessment and intervention specializes on information for speech-language pathologists and reviews treatment studies and actually puts those treatment studies in a language, in abstracts that clinicians and practitioners can understand. So the advantage here is if you don't have access to all the research journals that are out there, you can turn your attention to a journal such as this one, and it summarizes for you what is currently available in terms of a literature base, and it picks out the most important articles and translates those in clear recommendations what should or should not be done for a given field. This one comes from a similar angle, also mostly focused on communication disorders, evidence-based practice briefs. The format here is organized somewhat differently. It always starts out with a clinical scenario. For example, you have a young child with severe autism and there's a lot of problem behavior. What are scientifically valid, evidence-based ways to tackle with that problem behavior? And then there would be a research review following that clinical scenario, and it would end in a clear clinical bottom line. What are the most promising techniques and which ones you should rather stay away from? This is publicly available. There's not a charge for this journal. It is sponsored by Pearson, a test company, diagnostic assessment company. And one nice thing about this, in addition to the paper journal, you get access to a podcast, an audio file you can download onto your MP3 player, and if you don't have the time to read through long articles, you can listen to the podcast version on your way to work. Escher has currently put out a larger compendium of reviews for different areas. You can check if you're interested in intervention or into treatment, and then check the area of interest. It can be anything from aphasia over AAC to voice disorders and swallowing disorders. And for every clinical subdiscipline, they have put out clinical practice guidelines. That's worth taking a look at. Specifically for ASD, there are a couple of resources, the National Professional Development Center on ASD and the National Autism Centers, that also review treatments, that put guidelines, practice guidelines, research summaries out there that inform practitioners and caretakers about what are the scientific valid methods and which ones have not reached that standard of an evidence-based treatment yet. The Wing Institute is something more for classroom teachers who want to know about instructional methods suitable for not just for autism, they are all across the board for special education and general education. All right, that sums up our little excursus into science versus pseudoscience. Do you have any questions?
So I'm no longer a student, and I struggle oftentimes to try to find evidence-based practice with which to cite,
Yeah.
my therapy. So if I like writing the evaluation report, I like to cite an article, and I go on Google Scholar, and I see something from Employment Healthcare, but I knew the abstract. So I wish there was, I don't know if you know any ways for like, for SLPs in the school district.
Right, right.
Yeah. If you're an ASHA member, you get access to all the ASHA journals. Yeah, but beyond ASHA, though, sometimes I find articles that aren't by ASHA. That I
Yeah,
like to
that you really like to have.
Do you know what I mean? That aren't by the JSLR.
That's where you befriend a university professor and email her.
Okay, fine. I also have to do that.
Yes, email the university professor for a PDF of that article. Like I said, this one journal is available for free. That might be a good resource, but again, it doesn't give you access to all those individual articles, just to some of the summaries.
Seriously, I mean, are we really, as like, when we're out in the field, that's really our resources are...
That's unfortunate. Yeah, I know it's unfortunate. Ideally, the institution or the school district should allow you to have access. They should subscribe to the major journals and whatever their populations are, but they just don't, right? It's not. There's no money for that.
National Institute of Health also has evidence-based articles that are
Summaries.
subscribed to them.
Yeah.
That you can download.
PubMed is a database also sponsored by National Institutes of Health that
It's mostly abstracts.
there's mostly abstracts there again. Some publishers for a little while may make some of the articles available for free, but not others. So, yeah.
Sometimes also when you go to like the author's website, if they have a website, sometimes they'll put their PDFs on there so you can download it that way. But not all people update their websites, so...
Yeah.
Another thing to check out would be see if you can join an alumni association, because sometimes you get access to the library resources through an alumni association. I don't know about San Jose State.
So yeah, it requires a little bit of creativity, get around those obstacles into finding the literature that you really need. All right, let's get started on AAC in autism, and then we'll take a break. We'll see how far we get this afternoon. I had prepared quite a bit for you folks, but you've been so active in asking questions, so we'll see how far we get through. We'll have a little bit of an overview on what the different AAC strategies are now, in particular for individuals on the autism spectrum. Then we'll focus in on picture exchange communication system and how to transition from there to speech generating devices and tablet devices. And hopefully we'll get to the point that I can introduce the app that we have developed at Purdue, SpeakAll, and talk a little bit about the effects of SpeakAll intervention and how to do parent training with SpeakAll. All right, I've disclosed that already, that I'm part of a company. And now, in general, there are three major strands of interventions in AAC for autism. We can start teaching manual signs and gestures. We can look at pictographic symbol sets and systems. Or we can go with the electronic devices and use high technology speech generating devices for synthetic or digitized speech output. So for practitioners, it's often a very difficult task to decide where do we start, which of the three major general strategies is the best one. And here again, we should be using evidence-based practice, using research outcomes as the basis to make those decisions. When I say evidence-based practice, I would refer to treatments, strategies that have reached a certain level of empirical support. The actual term evidence-based practice originally means the process of integrating research evidence with client preferences and clinical expertise. It's not just about the data or just about the evidence base. It means in addition to sound data, we also use our background as clinicians, our expertise that we're bringing to the table, and we're asking what are the families and the clients' preferences, and combining those three portions, the data, the client preferences, and our background, into a sound decision about what is the best treatment approach, the best venue to go down at a given point in time. The research piece is ideally fulfilling criteria for what is called empirically supported treatment. So this is the exact opposite to those pseudoscientific approaches that we had been discussing earlier. And an empirically supported treatment, that is something that has already reached a certain threshold of research evidence. And these criteria, they vary. The National Autism Center has different standards than ERSHA has, than the Wing Institute has, and so forth. However, across all these institutions and bodies, there's always the notions we need to have a series of individual studies, and not just from one location. They should be replicated by different research teams at different locations. All of those research studies should then verify the treatment effects, the intervention results, and then we would call it an empirically supported treatment. Right? When I'm going through these three major strategies, I'm talking about the evidence, or I'm presenting those studies that are fulfilling those criteria. Okay? So I'm taking this evidence-based look. I'll summarize the AAC strategies in terms of what is actually empirically supported here. What is it that the research literature is saying about them? So we'll start with manual signs and gestures. And manual signs, as probably most of you know, is an unaided form of communication, and that means we do not rely on any aid or devices external to the body, and we are only using body parts. Manual signs was one of the first forms of AAC that was applied to non-speaking individuals on the autism spectrum, had been introduced in the 1970s and used successfully for more than 30 years. When clinicians say they are teaching science, they are engaging in manual science, that can mean two different things. They might teach the entire system, the entire linguistic code of American Sign Language, or they might just pick some manual signs out of that repertoire and use that as a code for spoken language. That later scenario, just teaching a limited set, is more common in kids on the autism spectrum. By the mid-1980s, manual signing was often used in combination with speech. So the clinician would produce the sign and would also say the word for that sign to support comprehension or production of that same approach in the client. And this method was called total or simultaneous communication, SC for short. Manual signs and gestures are somewhat different. Gestures typically are much more simpler, don't have these linguistic code and system and rules behind them than manual signs do. What does the literature say about why is it advantageous to engage in manual signs? First, there is an idea that these are easy to imitate. Individuals on the autism spectrum may have difficulty controlling their vocal folds, and this is often proposed as a notion, why are they non-speaking, why are they minimally verbal? But they might display strengths with imitating actions. They can look at you, you're modeling something, and they can easily imitate that action. Signs tend to be less transient than words, and thus they become less frustrating to learn than vocal speech. Listening to a speaker, attending to vocal speech, the word is over in a millisecond. The phoneme is gone in a very brief amount of time. Looking at me producing a manual sign can take several seconds, so the manual sign production stays on longer, and it can be repeatedly being done. And by that, maybe that's an advantage. It doesn't go away that fast than vocal speech. And by producing that action, by carrying out that manual sign, maybe this is also more iconic, a more direct representation. I mean, this is easy to understand. I'm not fluent in American Sign Language, but many of the signs are highly iconic to write, drink and juice, and many of those very easily resemble what they stand for. So for those that have a negative history of speech, it's been suggested this may help them overcome those hurdles and may be a good strategy. So what is the literature now providing in terms of evidence for those claims? In general, the research literature falls into two categories, into studies that provide evidence for expressive signing, so keeping expressive communication going, giving the individual a means of enhanced communication and producing utterances. And then there's another strand of literature that talks about how does this help with language comprehension if I engage in teaching manual signs. So for teaching individuals on the autism spectrum to use manual signs as an expressive mode of communication, there are 5 studies that meet evidence-based practice criteria, and overall they include 22 participants. And they all teach manual signs to those participants and then monitor how well are these individuals doing in terms of manual sign production and producing messages that way. And it turns out, when you look at how strong is that treatment effect across those 5 studies, they all turn out to be highly successful, and we would call a treatment effect then highly effective. When researchers looked at this method of simultaneous communication, there was a little bit of mixed results. In one study, and this one study only has 1 participant that learned expressive language skills using 3 different instructional methods, the simultaneous communication, the sign alone, and the oral training. It turned out that simultaneous communication using both the sign with the verbal model, that this was superior to just teaching signs or to just trying to teach words and having that individual imitate or produce new words. All right. Then in another experiment on simultaneous communication, there was no difference being found between sign-alone training or SC. And in this newer study, in a group study with 10 participants who were exposed to a training program that taught object reference in the form of simultaneous communication, actually the sign-alone condition was superior to the other 2 conditions of oral instruction or SC. So it's a little bit mixed. Seems like this SC method works for some individuals better than it works for others. We don't have much more research on it. The field stopped to engage in total communication or simultaneous communication apparently some time ago. So what is the impact, what is the effect as far as the research literature is concerned on receptive speech, on the ability to better make sense out of spoken words if those spoken words are expressed as signs or are combined with the sign in simultaneous communication. In this early study, they compared the effects of SC and had a high effect size, highly effective versus sign alone. So again, this would speak towards that method for increasing receptive speech. In this later study, they provided SC training to 3 participants and measured their correct response on receptive language discrimination task. Again, on this area of receptive communication, the effect sizes were very high and turned out to be highly effective. In summary, what we would say about manual signs is both groups of experiments, those that look at increasing expressive communication as well as those that look at enhancing receptive abilities, both experiments yielded high outcome scores. The evidence would suggest it's a viable communication option for many kids, for a good amount of individuals on the autism spectrum. What might account for this is that manual signs could be a better choice in vocalization because it's easier to prompt an action from an individual, easier to get them to perform an action than it is to get them a vocalization. Like I mentioned before, manual signs can be highly iconic representation, more iconic than the spoken word, and motor imitation is often a very easy behavior to teach because the teacher can make use of physical prompting and fading procedures. So now, this all sounds fantastic. Here is now the drawbacks, the things to be careful about. You will still see that in a lot of autism treatment centers, manual signs are infused early on, targeted in no matter what kids get there, they all often engage in teaching them manual signs. The clinical field of augmentative alternative communication has, however, become more careful about teaching manual signs because especially in recent years, about the last 2 to 4 years I would say, there's more and more research evidence accumulating that manual signs may not be an option for everybody because more and more kids on the autism spectrum show up presenting motor difficulties. coarse motor as well as fine motor difficulties. So these motor control problems, they range from a general clumsiness over to pure muscle tone, over to, I said, difficulty with fine and gross motor skills. And this is not just the problem of a few. Newer studies show that this is seen in about 80% of children with autism. However, if you remember this morning, in the diagnostic criteria, there is no mentioning of any type of motor problem or motor issue that would make its way into diagnostic criteria. So what we then also observe is that those that are being taught manual signs, they often acquire only a limited sign vocabulary. They get a certain amount, 10, 15, maybe 20. Some we've seen even 50 or more, but never get fully fluent in what we would call American Sign Language. And those signs that they have tend to be poorly articulated, and again, this could be because of those fine and gross motor difficulties. Another big factor for many AAC clinicians is if they go down this venue of teaching manual signs, it puts a burden on communication partners. The social environment may not be fluent in sign language, and that for many can be unacceptable. And you're in a situation where in one context the child can communicate with those signs and they get around with that in their school classroom or within the therapeutic context, but once they get into the community or at home, people don't know manual signs, and then they kind of have no viable means of communication in there. An interesting experiment was done in the late 80s. 2 adolescents with autism were taught to order fast food, interacting with stuff that is unfamiliar to them. So they walked into a fast food restaurant, and there were 2 conditions of that experiment were being set up. In one condition, they tried to order fast food with manual signs. In the other condition, they tried to order fast food with graphic symbols on the communication boards. The people behind the counter only understood up to 25% of the manual sign requests, but understood 80 to 100% of the graphic symbol requests. Again, good point here. It's teaching manual signs limits you in terms of who you can communicate with, who, when you go outside of your familiar communication partner context, other environments may just struggle with intelligibility. For the researchers, this means we have to do much better in terms of looking at how does manual signing compare to aided forms of communication. What are the relatively advantages and disadvantages of teaching manual signs versus graphic symbols, for example? And can we get to the stage where we come up with interventions where manual signs are part of a multimodal communication system, where those manual signs may be used for communication with immediate caregivers and teachers, but once I get out of that familiar context, I can use something different, something else, such as a communication board, such as a speech-generating device, maybe simple vocalizations or word approximations if those are available. We would be calling this the conditional use of manual signs. Is it even possible to get children on the autism spectrum to this level where they understand, with my close buddies and communication partners, I'd be using manual signs, and this is an easy way for me to produce an utterance, generate utterances, and if I'm meeting someone new, I'm in an unfamiliar context, then I switch over to my communication board or electronic communication device. That, from the research perspective, would be the ideal thing to happen, but we haven't really investigated this, neither have we come up with interventions and strategies to get to this multimodal communication system. In AAC, we always talk about the promises of creating a multimodal communication system, but in practice, kids are often limited to one specific type of strategy. Okay, related to manual signs are gestures. Gestures are more like body movements, coordinated body movements to represent an object, idea, action. They don't have all these linguistic features of manual signs. We all know some simple gestures, pointing, yes, no head shakes. And we've talked earlier this morning that gestural development is quite important. It serves as a precursor to later speech and language development. Individuals on the autism spectrum, however, rarely use gestures as an alternative communication strategy, even if they have difficulty speaking. What does the research literature say about why it might be good and advantages to teach gestures to kids on the autism spectrum? It's a precursor to later language skills. Gestures also are important for establishing and maintaining social action and social reciprocity, which are core deficits on the autism spectrum, as we have heard this morning. And then gestures are very appropriate for early AAC intervention because they help symbolic development going. An easy gesture can get the idea one thing, the gesture can stand for something else. The motor demands are not as much of an issue as those with manual signs. So even if kids have some motor control problem, they might still be able to learn gestures even if they struggle with the more sophisticated manual signs. What does the research now provide in terms of data to support gestures? Unfortunately, there isn't a whole lot of data on this very interesting and important issue. Basically, I think there's only two studies. Yeah, only two studies that have looked at teaching gestures in more depth to kids on the autism spectrum. And again, I'm talking about studies that meet evidence-based criteria. Not anecdotes, not clinical case reports, but studies that we would actually be using for clinical decision-making from an evidence-based practice perspective. In this one, Buffington and colleagues taught gestures in combination with oral speech, and they measured the frequency of correctly produced gestural and verbal responses, and that turned out to be a highly effective intervention for all four participants. In another experiment, these folks here provided training in communicative pointing to obtain a toy, observed frequency that the pointing occurred, and again, this is like a measure of effect, the percentage of non-overlapping data. These effect measures turned out highly effective for all four participants. So it looks like teaching gestures has a lot of promise, and this could be another viable AAC strategy for kids on the autism spectrum, but we have a very limited amount of studies at that time. It looks like gestures are underrepresented and not well researched in this population. This is very surprising because there's a strong correlation between once a child engages in gestures, a good likelihood they would also start to vocalize. Oftentimes, initial vocalizations are paired with gestural use, and that precedes speech development. So again, the researchers have to catch up here with you guys in the clinical field and build up empirical support. When is gestural communication appropriate? What are more of its pros and cons? And how does it compare to other available AAC interventions? There was a question over there I wanted to.
So for all these studies, they're all, the participants were children with autism?
Yes, this is autism only. Okay. Right? It would not, from a scientific purpose, you would find more studies if you go broader and you go to look into developmental disabilities, cognitive impairment, intellectual disability, Down syndrome, and so forth. You would probably find a few more studies. But this is not, it would not scientifically be valid to kind of throw them all together and to say what worked for children with just intellectual impairment would also work for those that are on the autism spectrum. So, all right, can you folks hang in another 10 minutes so we can capture exchange-based graphic symbol sets, and then we'll break. Okay? Good. So, actually, exchange-based communication had been out for a while, even before this was turned into what is nowadays known as a picture exchange communication system, or PECS. PECS is just the more prominent, the version of it that got marketed and got trademarked. All of these exchange communication approaches, they rely on the notion there is a set of behavioral strategies to teach the use of visual graphic symbols for communication. In particular, what it does is it teaches to make requests by exchanging symbols